My name is David Thompson. I'm 67 years old, and I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah. For over 40 years, I was a devout Mormon, a man who believed with all his heart that he was serving God and doing what was right. I lived for the church. Every decision, every word, every dream was guided by what I believed to be the Lord's will. But as the years passed, I began to see things no one should see inside a temple. Things that made me question everything I believed about faith, obedience, and truth. It wasn't easy to admit that something was wrong, because for decades, I convinced myself that the problem was me. But today I speak out, because there are silences that weigh more heavily than any sin. Comment from which city and country you're listening. I want to know how far my story reaches. Like and subscribe to the channel if you believe that faith must go hand in hand with truth. I grew up in a simple family in a small town near Provo, Utah. From a young age, I learned that the church was the center of everything: morality, truth, and salvation. My parents were devoted believers, and each Sunday felt like a reminder that our lives only had meaning if they were completely aligned with the restored gospel. I remember the first time I felt what they called a burning testimony. I was in sacrament meeting, and an elderly man was talking about the prophet Joseph Smith. His words touched me deeply. I was only 14, but at that moment, I decided I wanted to be like him, faithful, obedient, courageous, ready to serve at any cost. As a teenager, my faith became my identity. While my friends were busy partying and playing sports, I spent my nights reading the Book of Mormon and praying to feel the Spirit. I believed that every answer, every warm feeling in my chest, was a direct confirmation from God. When I turned 19, I was called to serve a mission. I received my badge with the name Elder Thompson, and I felt an indescribable pride. I was ready to change lives to bring the light of the gospel to those who still lived in the darkness of ignorance. The mission was the most intense period of my youth. We would wake up at 6:30 a.m., study the scriptures for hours, and then hit the streets, knocking on doors. I didn't see fatigue, only purpose. Every no we received was a test of endurance. Every yes was a heavenly victory. I believed that the prophet was the living voice of God, and that serving the prophet was the same as serving Christ himself. This idea stayed with me for decades, shaping my view of the world, authority, and truth. During those years, I developed a genuine love for people. I often cried when I saw humble families accept the lessons and kneel to pray with us for the first time. I believed I was bringing them salvation, that my sacrifice, my dedication, and even my youth dedicated to missionary work would be rewarded in heaven. When I returned home, I felt like a spiritual soldier returning from war. Everyone in the community looked at me with respect, and my bishop embraced me and said, "The Lord is proud of you, son." Over time, this respect became a kind of armor. I was the young example in the ward, the one who always said yes when asked for help, the one who prayed long and sincerely, the one who was always ready to serve. I married a woman from the church, a sweet and dedicated young woman who saw in me the same radiance of faith that everyone else saw. Together we became a model couple. We attended every meeting, helped with activities, and were praised by the leaders. At that time, faith gave me security. I never imagined it could become a prison. There was something enchanting about Mormon discipline. Everything was predictable, structured, and pure. I liked knowing what was right and what was wrong, being able to measure my spiritual worth by the number of rules I followed. The monthly fast, the tithing, the worthiness interviews, all were part of a system that made me feel worthy. I was, without a doubt, a true servant of the Lord. There was no room for doubt. If I felt sadness, I believed it was the adversary trying to lead me away from righteousness. If I saw injustice, I told myself God had a hidden agenda. I remember a time when a close friend decided to leave the church. He said he had discovered things in the scriptures and history that didn't make sense. I was shocked. I spent hours trying to convince him to return, telling him that doubt was a temptation and that the prophet would never lead us astray. At the time, I truly believed this. The idea of questioning leadership seemed like an unforgivable sin to me. I felt proud of my obedience. I thought that was what made me a good man. Faith, for me, wasn't just belief, it was identity, it was duty, it was everything I was. I had no other worldly reference point outside of the church. Everything I did, dreamed, or planned was wrapped in prayers, blessings, and approval. I believed that the more I obeyed, the closer I would be to God, and that the sacrifice of personal freedom was the natural price of eternal salvation. Looking back now, I realize how that zeal was a mixture of sincere love and naivete, but back then, I didn't see any naivete. I saw purpose, mission, spiritual glory. When I saw the leaders taking the pulpit, in suits and ties, I felt I was before men inspired directly by God. And when the prophet spoke in general conference, his words seemed to come from heaven. In my youth, I was pure in my intentions, but blind in my perception. I believed that every pain was a test and that every doubt was an enemy. I didn't know that one day, it would be doubt, the one I so feared, that would free me, but that would come much later. At that point in my life, I still believed that the greatest sign of faith was never to question. I lived with my eyes closed, but my heart filled with light. And perhaps for that very reason, I didn't notice the shadows that were already beginning to form around me. For many years, I truly believed the church was perfect. Not just a community of faith, but a direct extension of heaven on earth. There was a sacred order to everything. The talks, the meetings, the hymns, the way each person dressed, carried themselves, and even smiled. Everything conveyed purity, reverence, and harmony. When I walked through the halls of the temple, amidst that almost heavenly silence, I felt I was standing on holy ground. The soft lights, the murals of Christ, the scent of fresh flowers, everything seemed carefully prepared to remind us that this was the only true path to God. I deeply admired our leaders. They were living examples of what it meant to be a servant of the Lord. They spoke in calm voices, always with gentle smiles and steady eyes, full of conviction. Each general conference was a near-sacred event. Entire families gathered to hear the prophet, and his words echoed like commandments straight from heaven. When he said, "Thus says the Lord," there was no room for questioning. For us, the prophet was never wrong, and if something seemed wrong, the error was ours, not his. I remember a time when a local leader was suddenly transferred to another stake. Many wondered why, but no one dared speculate. The teaching was clear. God's ways are not our ways. That phrase was enough to silence any curiosity. I learned to accept everything with humility, or at least, I thought it was humility. Today I realize it was fear disguised as faith. The church environment was so well organized that even feelings seemed to have a manual. There was a right way to rejoice, a right way to cry, a right way to express repentance. Spontaneity was viewed with suspicion. Everything had to be dignified, controlled, and orderly. Families had to appear happy, children had to behave well, and leaders, the leaders had to be beyond reproach. I grew up believing that within the church there was no room for human error, only for spiritual perfection. Sundays were the highlight of the week. We would put on our best clothes, polish our shoes, and leave in silence, ready for another day of worship. In the chapel, the organ sound echoed and voices sang in unison hymns that seemed to purify the soul. It was impossible not to be moved. Everything there was designed to touch the heart and at the same time shape the mind. The environment exuded holiness, but also a subtlety of control. The way we sat, when we stood, the tone of our voices in prayer, even the way we looked at the pulpit. When I observed the bishops, the stake presidents, and especially the prophet, I felt a mixture of admiration and awe. They were presented as men personally chosen by God, guided by direct revelation. I believed that if they said something, it was because the Lord himself had spoken first. This belief brought comfort, but also a tremendous burden. If something didn't make sense, it was a sign that I still didn't have enough faith. It never occurred to me that perhaps the error might be beyond me. There was an unwritten motto among us: obey first, understand later, and I obeyed. We all obeyed, because we believed that questioning was the first step to apostasy. Obedience was considered the greatest virtue, more important than empathy, more important than compassion. We believed that blindly following leaders was the same as following God. And so, little by little, I learned to silence my own thoughts in the name of faith. But there was something subtle that bothered me, even in times of greater devotion. I saw people suffering, but no one talked about it. I saw young people being reprimanded for minor sins, while others, closer to the leadership, were spared. I saw families fall apart in silence, with smiles on their faces, pretending everything was fine. And yet, we told each other, the church is perfect. It's the people who fail. It was a phrase that served as a shield against suspicion, a graceful way of ignoring discomfort. As the years passed, I began to realize that this image of perfection came at a cost. The pressure to appear worthy was suffocating. If you made a mistake, even in secret, you lived in fear of being discovered. If you had doubts, you kept them to yourself. If you felt sadness, you feigned joy. It was a spiritual theater where everyone knew their roles, but no one dared deviate from the script. The temple, which was supposed to be a haven of peace, often felt like a showcase where faith was displayed, but rarely truly felt. I still believed in the church with all my heart. But in quiet moments when the house was empty and my heart was restless, a nagging question tormented me. What if the fault is not in me? I suppressed this thought with prayer, fasting, and scripture study. I told myself it was the adversary trying to weaken my faith. But deep down, something was beginning to stir a seed of doubt, planted by small inconsistencies I could no longer ignore. The church's perfection was like a spotless white wall, but if you looked closely, you'd begin to see the cracks. Small, almost invisible, but real. And once you saw them, you could no longer pretend they weren't there. Still, I kept painting over them, trying to keep the appearance intact. I believed that faith demanded this, to hide the cracks and trust that God would take care of the rest. I didn't know that one day, it would be these very cracks that would cause the wall to collapse. Obedience was the foundation of everything. From a young age, I learned that being a good Mormon meant following every rule exactly, even those that seemed too small to matter. There was a manual for every aspect of life: how to speak, how to dress, what to eat, what to read, what to watch, and even how to think. It was as if every breath needed spiritual approval. Every decision in my life needed to be evaluated by someone above me. If I wanted to change jobs, plan a trip, get married, or even get a different haircut, I consulted a leader. Not because anyone explicitly forced me to, but because the system taught me that obedience was the only way to be safe. The spiritual control was subtle but total. We had worthiness interviews, private meetings with the bishop or stake president, where we were invited or pressured to confess our sins. They asked about purity, thoughts, desires. It was a constant confession, an invisible tribunal where silence could be interpreted as guilt. I sat before men I believed to be representatives of God, and I poured out my soul, hoping for forgiveness. But I often left with more fear than peace. I remember one time when I was called in for one of these interviews. The bishop asked me if I read only the official scriptures. I said yes, but I hesitated for a moment, and he noticed. Then came the next question. Have you been reading anything outside of the church's materials? I was silent for a few seconds, and that was enough. He looked at me with a heavy expression and said, "Be careful. Satan begins with curiosity." I left that room feeling that even thinking could be a sin. From then on, I began to monitor my own thoughts. If a doubt arose, I suppressed it with prayer. If something bothered me, I fasted. It was like living within an invisible fence, but reinforced from within. I believed I was free after all. I could choose to serve or not. But the fear of spiritual punishment, the fear of losing my temple recommend, or the fear of shaming my family kept me from truly choosing. I obeyed out of love, or perhaps out of fear of not being loved by God. Over time I realized that obedience, once so light, became a burden. Everything was a test. If something went wrong, they said it was a lack of faith. If the blessing didn't come, it was because I wasn't worthy enough. This idea consumed me. I lived in constant self-analysis, trying to find what I was doing wrong. There was no spiritual rest, only vigilance. And the more I obeyed, the less I recognized myself. Worthiness interviews were only part of the system. There were also attendance reports, weekly invitations to serve in new callings, and community oversight. Everyone watched everyone else. If a member failed to attend meetings, they were immediately visited. If someone showed signs of weariness or sadness, the leaders appeared with the same compassionate smile and the same warning tone. The enemy attacks when you walk away. The intention might seem good, but the effect was suffocating. There was no room for human error, only for the appearance of righteousness. I became an example, but a tired one. I began to realize that my behavior was no longer driven by faith, but by fear of being judged. In priesthood meetings, men would stand up to give testimonies about how the prophet was inspired, how the rules were perfect, how obedience brought peace. I repeated the same words, but inside I felt something different, an emptiness, a restlessness I couldn't explain. Once, during a conference, a leader said something I've never forgotten. Doubt is the first step to downfall. He who questions is already halfway to salvation. This phrase echoed in my mind for years. I began to fear my own thoughts. When something seemed wrong, I convinced myself it was simply a lack of faith. When I saw injustice, I told myself, God knows what He's doing. But deep down, I began to realize that this unquestioning faith wasn't faith at all. It was submission. Blind obedience comes at a price. It dulls the conscience. I no longer knew how to distinguish right from wrong on my own. If a leader said something contradictory, I accepted it without thinking. If I was asked to do something that offended my sense of justice, I did it in the name of duty. It was as if critical thinking were a sin and conscience a threat to faith. The most painful thing was realizing that this structure wasn't just outside of me, it was inside. I had internalized the voices of authority. Even when no one was watching me, I policed myself. Even when I was alone, I censored myself. The fear of disappointing God had become a prison I kept locked inside. Little by little, I began to realize that absolute obedience wasn't bringing me closer to God. It was taking me further away from myself. I followed rules, but I no longer felt the Spirit. I prayed, but they sounded hollow like mechanical repetitions. I read the scriptures, but the words seemed distant, cold. It was as if my faith had become a routine and my soul an echo. Today I understand. The real danger wasn't breaking a rule, but failing to listen to one's conscience. Back then, however, I still didn't have the courage to admit it. I kept smiling, serving, obeying. But deep inside, something was beginning to break silently, like a crack in the stone. I was about to discover that faith that doesn't allow for questions is just another form of fear disguised as holiness. As the years passed, I began to notice small cracks in the perfect image the church projected. These were details I'd previously ignored, but now insisted on lingering in my mind. Inside the church, I saw smiles that hid arrogance. I saw confessions used as weapons. I saw leaders who preached humility from the pulpit, but demanded blind obedience and absolute respect outside of it. It was as if there were two churches, the public one, full of light, and the internal one, shrouded in shadows no one dared mention. A young man was once disciplined for misconduct. He wept before the council and begged for forgiveness, saying he had made a human error, nothing serious. But weeks later, I heard that the same leader who had severely punished him was engaging in similar behavior protected by his position and the complicit silence of those around him. It hit me like a silent blow. For the first time, I wondered if everyone was truly treated equally, or if privileges existed within that sacred system. The temple meetings began to make me feel strangely uneasy. The once peaceful atmosphere now felt cold and heavy. The leaders' words sounded rehearsed, and the looks in their eyes, especially among those in higher positions, conveyed something beyond faith, power, a power disguised as spirituality. There was something in the way they spoke of purity and dignity that made me feel guilty, even without knowing why. I remember one Sunday when a bishop recounted a personal miracle. He said he had received a direct revelation to discipline a sister who had lacked modesty, Everyone applauded him as an example of divine inspiration. But what I saw was a humiliated woman, trembling in silence, with no chance to defend herself. That episode deeply disturbed me. For the first time, something inside me whispered that this was not from God. But I remained silent. Because in the church, silence was a sign of faith. To speak was to doubt, and to doubt was to fall. I told myself that perhaps this was all just a trial, a test to strengthen my testimony. I prayed, asking God to help me understand. And for a time, I managed to convince myself that the problem was within me. The shadows became clearer when I began to understand how the system treated confession. Those who opened up in search of forgiveness became vulnerable, and sometimes their weakness was used against them. I've seen people lose positions, friendships, and even access to the temple for confessions that should have been received with compassion. It was as if forgiveness depended more on the convenience of leaders than on God's mercy. On one occasion, I was called to assist in a private meeting with other priesthood holders. They were discussing the situation of a member accused of spiritual rebellion. When the man was mentioned, I realized he had simply asked legitimate questions about the history of the church and its teachings. But the words used to describe him were harsh: influence of the enemy, lack of submission, intellectual pride. In that moment, I understood that doubt was seen as contamination, and those who doubted needed to be isolated before they infected others. Even in the face of these injustices, I still tried to believe there was a greater purpose. I told myself that God was testing my patience, that He was teaching me not to judge. But deep down, something inside me screamed that this wasn't holiness. It was manipulation disguised as faith. The worst part was realizing that no one seemed to notice. Everyone continued smiling, serving, repeating comforting phrases, while the truth was lost beneath layers of reverence. Little by little, I began to sense that the church I loved was no longer the same, or perhaps I was finally seeing what had always been there. I saw promising young people being ostracized for trivial mistakes, while leaders with more serious flaws were protected by inspiring confidence. I saw families destroyed by shame, forced to maintain appearances in the name of priesthood honor. I tried to pray, but my heart felt heavy. I asked for answers, but only silence came. Faith, which had once been strength, began to turn into doubt, and doubt into guilt. Maybe I'm being tested, I thought. Maybe God wants to see if I can remain faithful even when everything seems wrong. And so I continued deceiving myself with the hope that blind obedience was still a virtue. But somewhere along the way, I realized that the weight wasn't from God. It was human, cruel, made of hierarchy and fear. The shadows I saw weren't simple mistakes, they were choices. Choices made by men who had mistaken authority for divinity. Still, I kept going to meetings, wearing my best suit, smiling in photos, and saying "Amen" at the end of every talk. Inside, however, something had changed. It wasn't the same faith that drove me anymore. It was habit, the need to belong, the fear of losing everything I knew. And it was in this state torn between faith and reason, love and fear, that my soul began to crack. I still believed in God, but I was beginning to deeply doubt those who claimed to represent Him. I remember exactly the day everything changed. It was an ordinary Sunday, one of those where the church's routine seemed unchanged. Hymns, speeches, smiles, forced reverence. Everything was going as expected until, that morning, something began to sound strange. The bishop was tense, speaking little, and some leaders whispered among themselves in the hallway. Apparently, an internal problem needed to be resolved before sacrament meeting. No one knew for sure what was going on or pretended not to, but the atmosphere was different. I felt it in the air, as if an invisible weight hung over the church. Shortly thereafter, I was called into a private meeting with other priesthood holders. They said it would be a quick, confidential conversation. We entered a small, windowless room, and I quickly realized the tone was serious. The stake. President spoke in a firm voice, but his eyes avoided direct contact. He explained that one of the local leaders had been accused of inappropriate conduct, and that the church was handling the matter internally to preserve the dignity of the families involved. At that moment, my heart sank. I knew that leader. He was an admired, respected man, always leading meetings, preaching about purity and righteousness. I'd seen him blessing children, counseling couples, receiving confessions. And now, hearing that he could have committed something so serious left me devastated. But what shocked me wasn't just the accusation, it was what came after. The stake president looked at us all and said, in a calm, almost rehearsed tone, "This matter should not be discussed outside this room. Our priority is to protect the image of the church. The Lord will judge hearts, and it is not our place to spread anything that could cause confusion among the members." Those words pierced me like a blade. That man wasn't talking about justice, nor about welcoming potential victims. He was talking about protecting his image, about keeping up appearances. Silence, once again, was the sacred shield, and it was there, sitting in that cold room, that I realized my faith had been silently shattered. I left the meeting stunned. I remember looking at the hallway floor and feeling that the temple, once so pure, seemed different. The walls that had once conveyed peace now seemed complicit. Everything around me, the faces, the hymns, the words sounded empty, staged. I saw people smiling, unaware of what was happening behind the scenes. I saw the accused leader himself greeting worshipers as if nothing had happened. And I realized that truth, within that space, was a negotiable currency. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize what I had witnessed. I was told the case was under investigation, but weeks passed, and everything faded into silence. The man was still serving in his position. Families who dared to question him were advised not to entertain gossip. The subject became taboo, a secret buried beneath layers of forced spirituality. It was at that moment that I began to see the church differently. I realized that, within the institution I loved so much, there was a hierarchy where truth depended on the position of the speaker. If a leader made a mistake, it was called a trial. If an ordinary member made a mistake, it was a grave sin. Spiritual justice was selective, and faith was manipulated to keep the system running. I remember praying that night on my knees, begging God to explain what I was feeling. I asked for a sign, an answer, something to help me understand. But the only sound I heard was my own heavy breathing. It was as if heaven was silent, not because God couldn't hear me, but because he wanted me to finally hear what was inside me. That day made me understand that not all who speak in God's name live God's truth. This phrase echoed in my mind. Repeatedly, it was a harsh, cruel, yet liberating truth. I realized I had spent years confusing authority with holiness, power with spirituality, appearance with purity. From that moment on, nothing was the same. I began to notice looks, gestures, and silences that I had previously ignored. I saw how some members were favored, while others, more fragile, were excluded under the guise of discipline. I saw sincere people destroyed by unfair judgments. I saw confessions used to manipulate, secrets kept for convenience, and a culture of fear disguised as faith. The scariest thing was realizing that this wasn't an isolated error, it was part of the system. The system depended on silence, and we all, in some way, fed it. Every time we remained silent in the face of injustice, every time we repeated, "Leaders are inspired," without question, we strengthened the machinery that crushed consciences in the name of obedience. For a long time I still tried to justify it. I told myself that men can fail, but the church was true, that perhaps God allowed this to test my faith. But the more I tried to believe it, the more distant I felt from him, because there was no peace in protecting error, and there was no holiness in hiding sin. That day, something died inside me: blind faith, automatic submission, unconditional trust. But something else was also born: awareness, and with it, the courage to see what I had previously refused to see. It was there, in that cold room, surrounded by men in suits and ties, that I realized the truth that would change everything. Evil sometimes doesn't come from outside. It can dwell disguised within the temple, smiling and quoting scriptures. And when that happens, it's not faith that saves us. It's the courage to face the silence and choose the truth, even if it costs everything. After that day, something inside me simply collapsed. It was as if all the certainties I'd carried since I was young had been ripped away at once. The faith that had once sustained me became a kind of aching emptiness. I still attended church, but every hymn seemed like a distant echo. Every speech sounded rehearsed to me. The words that had once inspired me now sounded false, as if coming from mouths I could no longer trust. Nights became long. I lay awake, unable to sleep. I replayed everything I had seen, heard, felt. The voices of the leaders echoed in my head, those same voices that for years I had taken as the very voice of God. Now they sounded like masks. I prayed for answers, but heaven seemed silent. No matter how hard I tried, peace would not come. I felt I was losing something much deeper than faith in an institution. I was losing my sense of who I was. For years, my identity had been built around the church. Being Mormon wasn't just a belief. It was a way of life. Every choice, every thought, every action was filtered through the doctrine. And suddenly, none of it made sense. I went to Sunday services, but I felt invisible. I saw others praying fervently and wondered if any of them felt the same emptiness, or if I was the only one who had fallen from grace. The fear was constant, fear of being wrong, fear of being deceived, fear of losing everything: friends, respect, the temple recommend, eternal salvation. Because, in the church, leaving isn't just walking away, it's being forgotten. It's as if you cease to exist spiritually, and this idea terrified me. I didn't want to lose God, but at the same time, I could no longer recognize Him in that environment of control and silence. I remember one night when I tried to truly pray, as I had done before. I went to a corner of the house, turned off the lights, and knelt. The words came out broken, and tears came before I even said them. I said, "Lord, if you are still with me, show me where I went wrong." The silence that followed was so deep it hurt. It was then that I realized, maybe the problem wasn't my lack of faith, maybe it was the place where I was trying to find Him. I began to question everything. Why did we need so many leaders to reach God? Why did access to truth seem restricted to a select few? Why were the sins of the powerful covered up while those of the simple were harshly punished? These questions haunted me all day long, and at the same time, I felt guilty for having them. Because, according to the doctrine, to doubt was to distance myself from the Spirit. So I forced myself to believe, but each attempt seemed to push my soul deeper into the abyss of confusion. My body also began to react. I lost my appetite, my sleep, and little by little, my desire to be among my fellow church members. The sound of the hymns which had once moved me now caused a tightness in my chest. At each meeting, I would sit on the bench and look around, trying to recognize this place that had once been my spiritual home. But it was like watching a play in which I no longer knew my role. Spiritual betrayal is a silent wound. You don't bleed on the outside, but you feel like you're dying on the inside. That's what I felt, betrayed not only by men, but by the system that had taught me to call them the Lord's anointed. I felt like I had been deceived for a lifetime, and the cruelest part was knowing that I had participated in it myself, repeating words I didn't understand and defending things that now seemed absurd to me. There were times when I considered leaving immediately, throwing everything away, telling the truth, starting over. But something held me back, perhaps fear, perhaps guilt. The church had taught that those who abandon the covenant lose the Spirit and fall into darkness, and this thought haunted me. I wondered, what if they're right? What if leaving the church is the same as abandoning God? This doubt consumed me. I spent months in this internal conflict, trying to balance two opposing forces, the fear of leaving and the guilt of staying. Fear said, "You'll get lost." Guilt whispered, "You're already lost." I lived between these two worlds, present in the temple, but absent in spirit. Prayers became silent screams. The scriptures, which had once nourished me, now felt like a broken mirror. I read and found no comfort. I began to slowly withdraw, without announcing anything, only dropping out here and there. But even the silence betrayed me. Members began asking if I was okay, if I had sinned, if I needed spiritual help. I smiled, saying everything was fine, but inside I felt like something inside me had died, and I had no idea how to resurrect it. One Sunday, as the choir sang, I know that my Redeemer lives. I realized that. For the first time I couldn't sing. The words wouldn't come. And in that moment, I understood that something irreversible had happened. The faith that had once sustained me no longer existed in the same way. I still believed in God, but not in that institutionalized God, measured by reports and recommendations. I wanted the God I had known in the silence of my childhood, simple, human, true. I prayed for answers, but heaven seemed silent. This phrase sums up that period of my life. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence that called for courage. Courage to accept that perhaps the path to truth no longer passed through the doors of the temple. That sometimes to find God again, one must lose oneself from religion. And so my journey out began not in escape, but a slow, painful, and inevitable liberation. I still didn't know what I would find out. There, I only knew I could no longer pretend, because to stay would be to die, and to leave, even in fear, was the only way to live again. When I realized I wouldn't find answers within the church, I decided to seek them outside. At first, I was afraid. I knew that investigating on my own was seen as an act of rebellion, almost heresy. But I had reached the point where the silence of the temple suffocated me. I needed to understand. I needed to know if what I had seen was an isolated error, part of something much larger. I started slowly, reading articles I would have previously considered antagonistic, discreetly chatting with people who had left the church. The first time I exchanged messages with a former member was terrifying. I feared someone would find out. I still thought, like an insider, that any doubt would be seen as spiritual weakness. But that conversation changed everything. The person on the other side of the screen seemed calm, lucid, without hatred. Just tired. He told me something I've never forgotten. You are not alone. Many of us have seen the same things, but we kept quiet because we were afraid. Those words lit a spark within me. For the first time, I felt that perhaps the madness wasn't mine. I began reading testimonies, forums, and historical studies. I discovered documents that the church itself rarely mentioned about altered doctrines, ancient practices covered up, and decisions by leaders that seemed anything but inspired. Every text I read was like a window opening. And the more I learned, the more I realized how much we had been kept in the dark in the name of faith. The most disturbing thing was discovering that many had already questioned me before, and that all, without exception, were silenced. Some lost their families, others their jobs, and others simply disappeared from the community, erased as if they had never existed. It was the price of truth, being forgotten by one's brothers, only to be reunited with God. I read accounts of covered-up abuse, financial manipulation, and young people excommunicated for confessing doubts. And with each new story, I saw echoes of my own experience. It was like looking into a collective mirror of pain. I discovered that the truth was hidden from us, and that many had already seen the same horror, but remained silent. This phrase became a mantra for me. I began to understand how the church's structure worked not only through faith, but through the control of information. Everything was filtered, from manuals to speeches, from lessons to testimonies. Even our feelings had to fit pre-approved molds. If you talked too much, you were proud. If you questioned, you were weak in faith. If you suffered, it was because you weren't praying enough. The system always found a way to make the mistake seem like it was yours. But at the same time, the more I read, the more something inside me was released. It was painful, yes, but it was a different kind of pain. The pain of someone who feels again after years of numbness. For the first time, I began to see God beyond the walls of the institution. He was no longer limited to pulpit speeches or recommendations for worthiness. He was a silent but real God, a God who didn't ask me for blind obedience, but rather for the courage to think, feel, and act consciously. I began talking to other ex-Mormons. They were ordinary people, but with extraordinary stories of liberation. Some had been leaders, others simple members. All, however, shared the same wound and the same peace in having left. I discovered that there were entire communities dedicated to welcoming those leaving the church. And it was there that I realized something fundamental. The love and empathy I sought inside the temple were outside it. in the sincere voices of those who no longer had anything to hide. Still, the process wasn't easy. Each new discovery was a mixture of anger and relief. Anger at having been deceived for so long. Relief at finally seeing. Some nights, I cried in front of the screen, reading testimonies that seemed to have been written by me. Other times, I felt a strange joy, like someone recovering a piece of their own soul. There was a moment when I closed all my books and stared at the ceiling, taking a deep breath. I thought, if all this is true, then the God I followed wasn't the God I was raised to be. It was the God I already felt inside, before they taught me to fear him. It was in that moment that I understood that faith hadn't died. It had simply changed form. Spiritual liberation didn't come all at once. It was like the dawn, first a timid light, then a growing brightness until it illuminated everything that had previously been shadow. I began to feel peace again. Not the artificial peace of Sunday meetings, but an intimate, true peace, born from the simple fact of being honest with myself. I began to realize how much fear had ruled my life. The fear of doubting, of thinking, of making mistakes, of disappointment. But truth has a silent power. It asserts itself. And when I finally embraced it, I realized that God was never punishing me for seeking. He was waiting for me to find the courage to look at what had always been before me. Today, when I look back, I see that my faith isn't gone. It has been purified. I discovered that the true gospel isn't one of obedience, but of conscience. That serving God isn't about repeating words, but about living with integrity. And that the greatest form of worship is truth, even when it hurts. From that moment on, I knew my life would never be the same. I still felt the weight of what I had lost, my friends, my community, my belonging. But in return, I gained something infinitely greater, spiritual freedom. And that's when I understood what it truly means to be free in Christ. Not to obey out of fear, but to choose the truth out of love. When I started talking to other ex-Mormons, I realized something that changed everything. I wasn't alone. For so long I believed my pain was unique, that my crisis of faith was a personal failing, that something inside me had broken beyond repair. But when I met others who had experienced the same, I understood that the wound was collective and that many of us were simply trying to survive in silence. The first meeting was with a woman named Rachel. She had been a missionary, a primary teacher, an example of faithfulness. But when she discovered inconsistencies in church history, she was treated as a threat. We cried together during that conversation. She said something that stuck with me. I thought I would lose God when I left the church, but I discovered that it was within the church that I was losing him. Those words pierced me. It was like hearing my own story in someone else's voice. Then came others, men, women, young and old. Some had served as bishops, others as mere volunteers. All shared the same mark, the weight of blind obedience, the trauma of guilt, and the fear of thinking for themselves. We shared stories that had previously been impossible to tell, of emotional manipulation, of marriages destroyed by doctrinal pressure, of children who had strayed because they couldn't bear the burden of spiritual perfection. And in the midst of that collective grief, something began to blossom, understanding. For the first time, no one judged anyone. There were no hierarchies, titles, or dignity interviews. Just real, wounded people trying to heal each other. We laughed and cried together. We talked about how strange it was to live outside the system, how difficult it is to relearn how to make simple decisions without asking for a revelation, or to navigate Sunday without a meeting schedule. It was a mourning, but also a rebirth. I discovered there were hundreds, thousands of us, entire communities spread across the world, people who had left the temple to rediscover the God the church promised, but never delivered. I saw forums full of stories, podcasts, of former members sharing truths, support groups where no one had to hide their tears. It was as if a new kind of faith was being born, a faith without walls, without fear, without control. I remember the first time I met a group in person. We were in a simple house, no altars or pulpits, just chairs in a circle. Someone began by saying, "If you're here today, it's because you survived." The silence that followed was more sacred than any prayer I'd ever heard inside the temple. That group didn't offer me dogma, it offered me humanity. And it was there that I began to feel that God was still with me. It was then that I understood. I wasn't the only one who had lost faith inside a temple, and I understood that God wasn't trapped there. He never was. He was in that silent embrace between two former members who could finally tell the truth. He was in the courage of a woman who shared her abuse and was never heard from again. He was in the eyes of a man who confessed to having considered taking his own life because he felt he had disappointed the Lord, and who now smiled for the first time in years. These encounters showed me the true meaning of the word church. It wasn't the building, the leaders, or the rituals. It was the communion of sincere souls, united by the search for truth. There, without commandments, without rules, without fear, I found something I had never felt within religion: peace. A peace that didn't require purity, only honesty. The rebuilding of faith began in this simple space, without hymns or official scriptures. It began in nighttime conversations, in messages exchanged between strangers who understood each other more than any leader could. We learned to relearn God, to see Him not as a distant judge, but as a living presence in every gesture of compassion. We discovered that spirituality needs no labels. It needs only truth and love. Each story I heard was a piece of a larger puzzle that revealed a pattern. We had all been shaped by fear and liberated by pain. And this pain, however deep, was transforming us. We were no longer victims. We were survivors, and more than that, awakened. Over time, I realized I hadn't lost my faith. I'd simply purified it. It had stopped being a leash and had become a light, free wind. I could pray again, but now in my own words. I could feel gratitude without needing permission. I could make mistakes and learn, without carrying the weight of condemnation. Today, when I look back, I see that God never abandoned me. It was I who had distanced myself from Him by believing He only lived within sacred walls. But He was always with me, in doubts, in tears, and above all, in the courage to seek the truth. I still encounter many who are afraid to go out, afraid to think, afraid of losing everything. To them, I say what they once said to me: "You are not alone," because this is the greatest revelation of all no one is. There is a new community made of true faith and spiritual freedom where everyone is heard and respected, and in it, God's presence is more real than ever. Today I know the church may have tried to mold my soul, but it was outside of it that I found what it means to truly be a child of God, not through commandments, but through love, not through obedience, but through conscience, not through guilt, but through truth. And it is this truth, simple, human, and divine, that finally set me free. Today, after everything I've experienced, I understand something that took a lifetime to mature within me. God never asked for blind obedience. He asked for a clean heart and an awakened conscience. For so many years, I confused faith with submission, devotion with fear, obedience with love. I believed that following orders was the same as following divine will. But now I know that true faith doesn't require us to silence our reason, it illuminates it. The path to this point has not been easy. There have been sleepless nights, unanswered prayers, and days filled with silence. But it was in this silence that I found what the noise of preaching never gave me: the living presence of God within me. A God who didn't ask me for perfection, nor forced purity, but for truth. A God who dwells not in golden temples, but in hearts that dare to face their own conscience. Today I look back and see that man who once believed everything, who served fervently, who knelt hundreds of times believing that obedience was enough to be saved. I see him with tenderness, not regret. Because, deep down, he was sincere. He was simply trapped within a faith that brooked no questions. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that sincerity is never in vain. It's the seed that one day sprouts into freedom. Faith, when it's real, doesn't need walls, hierarchies, or titles. It's not fueled by the fear of making mistakes, but by the courage to seek. Because faith and fear cannot dwell in the same heart. Where there is fear, there is control. Where there is faith, there is light. And it was when I lost my fear that I finally found God, not the God of rules. interviews, or recommendations, but the God who welcomes me as I am, with doubts, scars, and a sincere desire to live truthfully. For a long time, I thought leaving the church would be the end of my spiritual life, but I discovered it was the beginning. Leaving wasn't abandoning God, it was drawing closer to Him. It meant stopping seeking the divine in the words of men and beginning to find it in the silence of the soul. I discovered that God's love is not measured by attendance at meetings, but by the compassion with which we treat others. That dignity is not earned through interviews, but through honesty. And that salvation is not found in belonging to an institution, but in living according to the truth of the heart. Today, I understand that faith that cannot be questioned is not faith at all, it is fear disguised as devotion, and that God has never been afraid of our questions. He fears only when we stop seeking Him for ourselves. Therefore, if there is anything I want to leave for those listening now, it is this invitation. Do not be afraid to seek the truth. Do not be afraid to see what has been hidden, nor to feel what they have tried to silence within you. Because it is on this path, even one filled with doubts, that true faith is born. I've seen many lose everything, friends, families, communities, just because they decided to follow their conscience. But I've also seen the peace that comes after the storm, the peace of those who can sleep without pretending, of those who can look in the mirror and see someone free. This is the peace that no institution can offer, because it doesn't come from outside. It comes from within, from the encounter between truth and the soul. And that's why today, I speak without fear, not to attack, not to condemn, but to free. Because silence protects the guilty, but the truth heals the wounded. Speaking is my act of faith. Telling what I've experienced is my way of praying. And if you're listening to this now, perhaps it's because you too feel something inside you asking for answers. So I tell you, don't ignore this voice. It's God's whisper. He doesn't want you to live in fear. He wants you to live awake, because faith isn't a prison, it's a path. And that path begins when you have the courage to open your eyes. Comment, I'm awake. I want to know the truth, so I know you made it to the end. Like and subscribe to the channel to hear more real testimonies, and see the other testimonies from those who also dared to tell the truth. And before I close, I want to leave you with this phrase that sums up everything I learned. Because true faith begins where fear ends. It is at this point, when we stop fearing what we might lose, that we begin to gain what truly matters, the freedom to live in peace with God and ourselves. Today, I know that faith is not measured by how much we obey, but by how much we love. And love, true, divine love, only flourishes where there is truth. If my story has reached you, it's perhaps because God wants to remind us that He never needed intermediaries to speak to the human heart, that He remains there, even when all temples crumble, and that His voice, when we finally hear it, doesn't shout or command, it simply whispers, "You are free."